Welcome to the Digital Insight Podcast, where today I'm joined by Sam Achampong, Head of CIPS MENA. Together, we discuss procurement maturity and how the MENA region is becoming a true benchmark for procurement excellence.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. Great to be on here.
No, it's a pleasure. So today we're gonna talk a little bit about sort of the evolving conversation around the maturity of procurement, something that I've spent a lot of time talking about in the last 12 months, and I'm excited to talk to you about it today. So obviously, with your role then with CIPS CIPS, tell me a little bit then, largely about, if you can, if we were to cast our minds back to early 2020, before the pandemic hit and the world sort of changed, as it were. When we look at the sort of the Middle East and we look at the kind of conversation around the maturity of procurement as a function, as a specialist function, as a professional function, where were we? Where were we in terms of just how much that was kind of becoming much more of a recognized key part of organizations?
So procurement in the Middle East was still a developing function, and to a certain extent, if you're looking at certain parts of the world, still lagged behind other parts of the world in terms of overall maturity and recognition of the function itself. So that's where we were pre-COVID, and I think everyone involved in the profession at any level recognized that. So significant efforts were going on to improve that, and they have been going on for many years to try and elevate procurement. The typical can procurement be elevated to the boardroom level? Can we get a seat at the table? Can the voice of procurement be part of more strategic business conversations? That sort of thing. So the efforts to bring procurement to the fore, procurement and supply chain really to the fore in the region have been going on for a while. And like everything else, I guess, since COVID, COVID has accelerated those efforts significantly.
Yeah, and we'll touch on that in a moment. But looking then, like you said there, a key thing was that you said it sort of lagged when compared to other parts of the world, to other procurement conversations that we were seeing. And you're not the first person to tell me that, and I'm always curious. As I'm not going to ask you, give me the reasons as to why, but what do you think were some of the contributing factors for it to be considered to be lagging behind when other spaces, were really accelerating their conversations?
I think it's just a question of business maturity. I think it's as simple as that. You find certain parts of the world. I mean, CIPS has been established since 1932. Was established in the UK, so that means there has been existing a professional body formally representing the profession of purchasing, as it was then called, since 1932 in the UK. That wouldn't be the case in many other parts of the world, not just the Middle East, until recently. And as business practices in general have progressed, so has procurement. So it isn't unique to procurement. It's in a way, it's in tandem with other professions. How strategic or professional maybe finance functions are, maybe how strategic and professional HR functions are. But procurement has, I guess, unnecessarily lagged for a period of time, not specific to region, but specific to the growth in business practices. But as this region continues to grow as a hub and a centre of excellence in many other areas, that's where the push to bring procurement to the fore has happened. And sometimes if you're in a region where you're really accelerating growth, expertise and innovation in any area, it can be a struggle to make the resulting business practices keep up. But that's where we are now, making sure that happens.
And you said a moment ago then about, when you said going back to that kind of pre-COVID world, that despite this kind of lag in that procurement maturity, it was being recognised. Organisations, government were recognising and progressing that story, that they recognised that procurement needed to grow, needed to change. And I guess that's where you come in with CIPS then, because I speak to a lot of people, particularly say in the Middle East region, and they will tell me about how they use CIPS as a benchmarking, not necessarily as a benchmarking tool, but just to be able to benchmark about the so-called best class procurement functions around the world. Kind of, it's a simple question really is how and why is that so important for a growing function and a growing kind of area to benchmark, to look at best practices around the world and to be able to call on a partner such as CIPS to do that successfully?
Yeah, I think it's vitally important in a in a growing economy, in a growing business sector, to be able to benchmark. So you need to know where you are. You need to have something that you're aspiring to and you're measuring yourself against. So that's where we come in, because with CIPS we operate across almost 150 countries. We have regional offices across each continent. So we do and have been working with different organisations, whether multinationals, NGOs, or governments, for many, many years. So the benefit we have is we're able to have that helicopter view and say, you are a government department, or you're a multinational organisation, or you're a retail function, or you're an oil and gas, and in procurement terms, in terms of best practice, for the best organisations, this is how we see them operating. And how do we know that? Because we've worked with them, we've gone through, procurement excellence programs, and we're able to, as an institute, we're able to acknowledge when we benchmark them against a standard. We're able to say that they are either here, or there. And subsequently, we're then able to say to organizations in the Middle East, and therefore you are at the same equivalency in terms of maturity or capability or performance as another organization somewhere else in the world. So that's where the benefit comes into it. And organizations here are very aspirational, they're very ambitious, and I think what we do find in procurement and in other areas is that they're not really just looking to aspire to be like an organization somewhere in the world. They're always aspiring to be better. They're always aspiring to be world leading, and that's quite refreshing for us, because they are able to look with fresh eyes and with innovative eyes to be not just as good as your equivalent organization, but better, and also to look for different ways to do that, which is where organizations here are able to adopt some of the technological solutions a lot quicker, perhaps, than even organizations in other parts of the world. So they're really able to adapt. They're able to leapfrog existing practices that may have actually gone out of date anyway, and they have the benefit of being able to adopt innovative practices without having to transform from old and embedded practices.
A few years ago, you and I spoke previously about just procurement maturity like we are today in the Middle East, and something you said at the time, which has always stuck with me, because as I've spoken increasingly to a number of CPOs in a number of organizations in the Middle East, it's becoming more and more evident. But you said that you can see the Middle East being recognized as, if not the global benchmark, then definitely a leading benchmark for procurement practice all over the world. Is that something you still stand by? And what do you think is going to be key to it getting to that position?
Oh, undoubtedly, I think, and it's the old cliche of it's not a question of if but when. I think what you have is organisations out here who are very ambitious, very innovative, very keen to be at the forefront of business operations and not only maturity but performance. So when it comes to procurement, they're very ambitious, very keen to have the best systems in place. So those that have that ambition, in this day and age, in the COVID age, they're very blessed that there is an abundance of technology that serves procurement and supply chain that they're able to utilize, and there's a huge adoption of technology relevant to procurement and supply chain in this region. And for that reason alone, I can really see the organizations out here really leapfrogging others around the world and fulfilling that ambition to be world leading where it comes to procurement and supply chain. You see a real adoption of all sorts of solutions, whether it's dashboard e-sourcing systems, supply relation management systems, or a whole gamut of solutions that allow practitioners to be a lot more strategic and less transactional. And the added benefit that organizations have here is that at the point that they are fully versed and fully engaged with procurement at the very highest level, they already have these tools at their disposal. They don't have to learn them. They don't have to unlearn anything. So that they're perfectly placed to really be world leading.
Yeah. So we've obviously mentioned it a few times, and we can't not really look at the sort of the broader impact of it. But of course, yeah, this last 12 months, and well, over 12 months now, COVID and the pandemic and the sort of the disruption that it's caused, obviously to businesses all over the world, as well as obviously human life. Kind of sum up as best as you can. What have you seen in terms of the Middle East procurement conversation? What's the impact been from COVID in terms of, has it propelled the procurement conversation forward, or has it held it back because businesses have had to worry about surviving as well as thriving? So they've kind of reverted back to what procurement should be about, or used to be about. Sorry, about just making sure that the costs were okay, or that sort of thing. Just give me an idea as to what the last 12 months has done for the procurement landscape.
I think to a certain extent they can be a mixed bag. I think you mentioned that some organisations can revert to form and look at the bottom line and start to save costs. But I would say by and large, it's been very, very positive, because what's happened is senior leaders have reverted to the procurement functions that they already have in place, looking for strategic solutions to navigate themselves sufficiently out of COVID. And I think the difference between the pandemic and maybe a recession or other events which require procurement to take a leading role of any description is that with the pandemic, the issues are multifaceted. So it's not just about reducing costs for the bottom line. It's also making sure you have resilient supply chains. It's also making sure that you mitigate risks. It's also making sure that your contracts are robust and you have sustainable relationships with your suppliers. Now, all of these things already exist as best practice recommended solutions and actions within procurement and supply. So all that's happening now is that procurement are being empowered to engage and implement the solutions that they're well placed to implement, and I guess to a certain extent have been chomping at the bit to do for a very long time. So yes, there is the aspect of people going back and saying, look, we need to reduce that bottom line. Great, that's a tool very high up in the procurement agenda, but they also realize that some of these things have to be sustainable, and again, that falls into procurement's lap, and procurement are able to come up with those solutions, and by doing that, it's in turn propelling that role or that positioning of a procurement function back to where people have always wanted it to be, at the strategic level, and rather than at the transactional level.
Yeah. And you mentioned sustainable supplier relationships there, and that's something that, particularly in the last few months, I've spoken more about with CPOs. Not necessarily to say that it wasn't important before, but obviously, given what's happened, the situation that people have been in, it's shone the spotlight on sustainable relationships in a much different way, much brighter light, as it were. And tell me a bit more about that then. Tell me a bit more about what you've seen in terms of, so for example, we've seen suppliers having to work a little differently and having to source different things, whether that's PPE and masks, or whether in some cases helping out in terms of vaccination centres and that sort of thing, really sort of changing the way that those suppliers have had to work with these organisations. Just tell me a little bit about what you've seen there, and about how the relationships how they've changed for the better forever, so to speak, in a permanent way, that they're now they're stronger, they can rely on each other a bit more. Just tell me a bit more about that, what you've seen.
Well, the key thing is that ultimately, organizations that had strategic relationships in place with their suppliers pre-COVID are the ones that are faring better, and the ones that will see a clearer path out of the pandemic. That seems an obvious answer here. However, a survey that we carried out in March 2020 bore that out, because in March 2020, the pandemic hadn't even really fully hit every aspect of businesses. But even then, in the survey we carried out, the vast majority of of organizations said things such as they plan to have closer relationships with their suppliers since COVID has happened. So that proves that that they see the benefit of those relationships. They can see the value that having a close relationship with suppliers has in coming up with joint solutions out of common problems. But if you didn't have that relationship already, then you're already a step behind. So if you have if you have competitors of yours that already had that strategic relationship with their suppliers, they're able to kick on a lot quicker with coming up with solutions out of COVID rather than to start putting solutions in place then. So you find things such as in our survey, we asked, or we found out that that there was a significant amount of organisations who found out that deliveries were going to be late. Deliveries of whatever supplies, materials, components were going to be late after the delivery date had passed. Now, that shows the inherent risk you have if you don't have that strategic relationship with your supplier, because conversely, organizations that were working strategically with their supply base, especially with their key suppliers, would have known that. So they would have been in the position to come up with risk mitigation strategies to overcome those supply chain disruptions. So suppliers working hand in hand. There's the legal and contractual risks. People were talking about force majeure, how it applies in a business environment. Again, if you take away the legal elements of that, you'll be more successful in coming up with solutions. Whether or not you have key clauses in your contract, the more strong your relationship with your supplier is. And then you go into other areas, because undoubtedly during COVID, you will have to seek new suppliers. Within the commodities you already buy, some of those suppliers may fall by the wayside. So again, having resilience and having proper risk mitigation strategies, you would have plan Bs and plan Cs, and if you had those in place already, that would directly affect the impact of price increases when you switch into different suppliers. So I think all around since COVID, which is a totally unforeseen situation, nothing that anyone could have fully mitigated against, because even people who take the approach of perhaps the world in general should not have put all of their eggs in one basket in terms of China, even that doesn't really bear out, because if you put all your eggs in the basket initially in Italy, you would have faced the same disruptions in the first kind of months of the pandemic. So the key thing is to have a risk mitigation strategy which is aligned with your supply base. And companies who have done that, organizations who have done that, the key thing is they're able to emerge a lot quicker and more successfully from those who start to put those strategies in place once something like a pandemic has already kicked off.
Yeah. So looking then a little differently than the last 12 months, obviously CIPS is known for obviously not just necessarily being used as a great tool to kind of benchmark against other procurement functions around the world, but also for recognizing, acknowledging, and awarding procurement functions and organizations for their successes, whether that's procurement excellence, whether that's best approach to certain to sustainability. CIPS is known for its awards and for recognizing best practice, and that's always been a very key thing for the function and for businesses. But how is that perhaps taking a different or a more how is that more important perhaps because of this last 12 months to truly recognize the great work that people have done over this last 12 months more than ever before, like if that makes sense?
I think that's a good point, and what you find out of situations like this, a global, not a global financial crisis, but a global pandemic. That's, as I said before, that has a lot more facets than a financial crisis per se. So yes, we recognise that, and the benefits out of that is you get a lot more case studies, a lot more real life case studies of what people can do what people have done and what people could do going forward. So, for example, when we had the Middle East Awards, the CIPS has award ceremonies around the world. We have the UK Awards, the Australasia Awards, the Africa Awards, and the Middle East Awards. And in the Middle East Awards this year, or rather last year, sorry, what we did was we added an additional two categories. And those additional two categories were specific to COVID. So we wanted to get for people to evidence how they had dealt with the pandemic in relation to business resilience, supplier relationship management, contract management mitigation. So we had an additional two categories rather, that acknowledged or identified people who had navigated out of the pandemic successfully and what they had done. And overall, I think it was no coincidence in our awards on this occasion that the overall winner and the organisation that ultimately won most awards overall was the Dubai Expo 2020 project. I mean, Dubai Expo 2020, a project that was due to a global event, a mega event almost, that was due to happen right in the eye of the pandemic in October 2020, something that's been planned for 20 years. A huge procurement exercise then had to be delayed for a whole year. So it's happening in October 2021. I.e. this year. So some of the case studies and some of the mitigation strategies, the re-engagement strategies and how they've navigated the pandemic from a procurement and supply chain point of view really were lessons in best practice. And we were able to acknowledge that and showcase that as well.
Yeah. And final question then. Obviously, we can't predict the next. Well, we can't predict tomorrow, let alone the next few months. But over the course of this next 12 months, as we continue to emerge into this kind of newer world, as it were, what do you think is going to be key for procurement in the Middle East in terms of its broader acceleration journey, in terms of getting to that position of that global best practice, becoming the benchmark? Like over the next 12 months, I feel like they're going to be quite significant in laying the foundations for the next 5 to 10 to 20 years. What do you think is going to be key over these next 12 months then for procurement in the Middle East?
I think it's the continuing adoption of technology. That's absolutely key, because that is, at the end of the day, in terms of accelerating business practices or procurement, that is absolutely key to moving the profession forward. Second is about continuing to empower people in terms of providing them the skills and the capabilities and the training that's needed to give them the overall breadth of business knowledge to be successful procurement people. Those are the two main areas really for procurement to continue to accelerate through this pandemic and any other pandemic in the future. Because actually what we found is that there aren't huge shifts in overall business practices as far as procurement and supply chain are concerned as a result of this pandemic or any others. Actually, what's been highlighted is that it's the fact that a lot of these practices and best practices have not been adopted fully or implemented fully that has adversely affected the procurement and supply chain functions or businesses in general. So if you look at supply chain risks or lack of supply or having to remap your supply chain, some of these things could have been mitigated to a certain extent if things like an over-reliance on single sourcing and things along those lines were not in place in the first place. And those are the kind of areas of business that from a best practice point of view, procurement never advocates anyway. So for organizations that had adopted the more nuanced and recommended strategies where procurement and supply chain are concerned, they wouldn't have avoided risk within the pandemic, but they certainly would have been able to navigate it to the very, very best of their ability. So we don't see a wholesale change in what's advocated as far as best practice. That's already there, but I think to augment that, the adoption of technology is absolutely key. because that takes organizations to the next level and future-proofs them to a certain extent against what's going to happen before. Technology, I think, like procurement in general, a lot of the technologies being relied upon during the pandemic have always been there. Zoom was not invented within during the pandemic; it was already there, and so to a certain extent, I guess. Organizations should have started to make more use of it and more reliance on these kind of platforms prior to that. But it goes across the board. Organizations talk about sustainability now, and really the less use of paper, the reduction in travel by vast amounts, 50% reduction in travel, 80% reduction in travel. The usage of technological solutions, electronic signatures, those technologies have always been there. They just haven't been adopted. But now they've been adopted, there is no going back. So the technology exists. The more widespread adoption of those technologies within the wider business and in procurement will certainly set us in good stead and enable not just the Middle East, but the wider world as far as procurement and supply is concerned to be well placed to continue to perform at a high level.